Hi, welcome back. Week 5, I think, of History 358. We left off last time talking about the policies associated with war communism, the policies that the party in power had implemented during the Civil War to try and deal with, to try and rectify the overarching problem of Razrucha, the complete collapse, disintegration of the economy in the context of civil war. Um, the policies associated with war communism, as we saw, were born from the same kind of coercive spirit that animated Bolshevik policy during the Civil War in general. Um, Economic policies during war communism were coercive, they were confiscatory, the forced requisitioning of grain at gunpoint by the Kombiedi, the Committees of Poor Peasants, and the food armies to bring grain from the countryside to the cities to feed the workers, get industrial production back on track, and restore some semblance of normalcy and hopefully growth to the faltering Soviet economy. And the problem of economic recovery, uh, to which the policies of war communism were aimed, were conceived of in this us versus them mentality, this sort of mentality of class warfare, the mentality of the dictatorship of the proletariat having the moral authority to use violence against its class enemies, in this case, particularly against the kulaks, in order to realize the objective of constructing socialism in Russia, achieving the goals of the revolution, and of course, from there, moving forward to the construction of true communism. So, war communism, the policies associated with war communism, centralized planning, the introduction of um, economic norms set by bureaucratic planners at VSNK, the Supreme Council of the National Economy, the requisitioning of grain from peasants. All of these policies, again, had a pragmatic goal, right? To get the economy back up and running, a kind of shock therapy, a coercive, violent attempt at shock therapy. But there's also, again, a utopian thrust behind all of this, a kind of wide-eyed, visionary belief, conviction on the part of the Bolsheviks that through these means, we will make that leap from the rubble of capitalism, now fallen, into the future of socialism. The problem with war communism, as we touched on last time, is that nobody outside the party likes it. The peasants, and not only the kulaks, but ordinary peasants, even the so-called poor peasants, are feeling the pinch, to put it mildly. Um, Peasant grain is being confiscated, and the confiscatory policy of seizing peasant grain produces the famine of 1920-21, which leaves 5 million men, women, and children dead. Beyond the peasant loss of life, there's also the military threat posed by the so-called green armies, the peasants who are arming themselves in the central Volga region, more than 100,000 strong, taking up arms against Soviet power. This is a real threat to the Bolshevik regime, even as the White Guard armies are being vanquished one by one, as Baron Wrangel's armies are preparing to make their final disastrous retreat from the Crimean Peninsula. The Bolsheviks now face this insurgent threat in their own backyard from 110,000 armed peasants, tens of thousands more arming themselves in Ukraine, arming themselves in Western Siberia. So by the beginning of 1921, where I want to pick up today, the policies of war communism appear to be driving the Soviet Republic straight into the ground. Famine, urban depopulation, and far from correcting the economic collapse, Razrucha, war communism seems to be hastening it. So you have, by 1921, an economy, let's call it the Russian economy, that is in shambles. Prior to World War I, the Russian economy had been the fourth or fifth, depending on how you count, the fourth or fifth largest economy on the face of the earth. By 1921, Russia was destitute, broke, its infrastructure, lines of communication, lines of transport completely demolished. Let me go to the slides here. Something has to be done, the party reasons. So again, you have the threat of peasant revolt. In February of 1921, 118 major peasant uprisings break out across the country. All of these are suppressed with merciless cruelty by the Red Army, but it severely damages relations and ties between the central government in Moscow and the provinces. And remember, Bolshevik support in the provinces had, since 1917, always been somewhat weak, somewhat tenuous. The Bolsheviks are losing the support of the working class, or what's left of it, right? We talked about urban depopulation last time. In February of 1921, again, this same kind of benchmark month, workers in 64 factories in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, go on strike. They're demanding more food, rations. They're demanding better working conditions. And these are the same factories in 1921. These are the same factories where the Bolsheviks had enjoyed overwhelming support in 1917. The workers are beginning to grumble. The workers are beginning to complain. They're writing petitions to the Council of People's Commissars, the government, pleading for reform. And not in mealy-mouthed conciliatory language. The workers are angry. The workers are pissed. One petition authored by striking workers to the Soviet government says, the Soviet regime, which was established in our name, in the name of the workers, has become completely alien to us. It promised to bring us socialism, but it has brought us empty factories and destitution. The worker discontent is furthered by increased restrictions on the autonomy of trade unions in February 1921. As we saw last time, those are placed under the regulatory control of VSNH. By February 21, the activity of trade unions is relegated even further to a mere advisory capacity. So you have peasants who are up in arms. You have workers who are on strike. And the soldiers and sailors are getting restless as well. The most important and dramatic of these outbursts of discontent took place at the Kronstadt Naval Base in the Baltic Sea, 20 miles west of Petrograd. And I want to focus a little bit here, just say a few words about the Kronstadt Sailor Rebellion of 1921. This was a really momentous event in the history of the revolution. The sailors of the Baltic Sea Fleet, which was based at Kronstadt, these sailors had been fiercely pro-Bolshevik in 1917. They had played a key role in staffing, manning the so-called Red Guards, the militias, loyal to the Bolsheviks that had stormed the Winter Palace, seized control of the city in October 1917. Trotsky himself referred to the Kronstadt sailors as the pride and glory of the revolution. This poster says, "Long live the revolution," and it reads at the bottom, "The Red Navy." The Red Navy was the pride of the revolution. It was the sailors, even more than the soldiers, who had brought the Bolsheviks to power, who had seized power on behalf of the working class. So long live the vanguard of the revolution, the Red Navy. But by the end of the Civil War, there's a change in the mood, and there's a change in the political sensibilities of the sailors. The Kronstadt sailors had been growing restless during the Civil War as tighter and tighter discipline was imposed upon them. During the revolution, the Red Sailors had formed so-called ships committees, where they elected their own officers. They sort of made their own autonomous decisions about how their units would operate in peacetime and in conflict. During the Civil War, as Commissar of Military Affairs, Trotsky took power away from the sailors. Political commissars appointed by the Commissariat of Military Affairs were appointed to govern and administer the sailors' units. The sailors lived in awful conditions. They had inadequate rations, inadequate clothing and blankets and jackets. The barracks were cold, unheated because of fuel shortages. And at the end of 1920, malnutrition was at such a point that there was an outbreak of scurvy among the sailors at Kronstadt. This triggered a spike in the rate of desertions. Sailors who have simply had enough pack their bags and go back home. Sailors who are members of the Bolshevik Party, party members, resign in protest. They turn in their party cards. This was the sort of symbolic and literal way of resigning from the party. You turned in your party card and said, I'm done. And as worker strikes increase in Petrograd in February of 1921, that discontent simmers back to the Kronstadt naval base. Enough is enough, the sailors decide. The conditions have become intolerable. We made the revolution in 1917. We put this government in power. We thought they were bringing us socialism. What have they brought us? It's time to take action. The sailors at Kronstadt, acting on their own, elect what they call a revolutionary committee, and they adopt a resolution expressing their grievances and their demands. And I've asked you to read this week the demands of the Kronstadt sailors. The sailors declare that they are in full sympathy with the striking workers in Petrograd, their brothers, their fellow proletarians. They declare also that they have a lack of confidence in the present Soviet government. Why? Because the present government, the Bolshevik regime, does not express the will of the workers and peasants. And this is a damning indictment for the sailors to throw in the face of the commissars. What legitimacy the Bolshevik government can claim, or lay claim to, is that their authority, their sovereignty, their right to rule comes from the will of the workers and peasants. And here, the Kronstadt sailors are saying, no, the Bolshevik government does not represent the workers and peasants. It would not treat the workers and peasants and soldiers and sailors the way it does if it truly represented the interests of the laboring masses of Soviet Russia. The Kronstadt sailors call also in their resolution for immediate, free, and open elections. Elections that will be open to all left-wing socialist parties. In other words, we can't have a one-party state. Let the SRs stand for office. Let the Mensheviks stand for office. They call for an immediate end to grain requisitioning. They call for the peasants to have free right to use their land, as long as they don't use hired labor. So they don't want to empower the kulaks, right? These guys are radicals. These are revolutionaries, these sailors. But they want to actually empower the social classes for whom the revolution was made and won. Very important to note that the sailors are not calling for the overthrow of the Bolshevik regime, right? But they are calling for a sort of small d democratization of how politics is being performed. Not every decision can be made behind closed doors by party elites, by high-ranking commissars. That's not why we had a revolution. You have to involve the people, the laboring people, the workers, the peasants, soldiers and sailors. So the sailors are calling upon the Bolsheviks to actually make good on their slogans, to live up to the slogans that helped put them in power. Give political power, give some free exercise of power to elected councils, Soviets. The party must relinquish its tightly held monopoly on power. And if they don't, if the party does not do this, the sailors warn ominously, then we'll have a third revolution. Right? We fought under the banner of all power to the Soviets, all power to the councils of workers, soldiers, sailors, and poor peasants. We did not fight under the banner of all power to the party. We want socialist freedom, not a one-party dictatorship. So these sailors are angry, right? They're angry and they're responding to the policies of war communism, the privations produced by the policies of war communism, right? This isn't what we signed up for when we supported the revolutionary cause. We fought a revolution for freedom, not for coercion and terror. And if the Bolsheviks bring us nothing but hunger, loss of freedom, then why on earth did we fight and bleed for the revolution in the first place? The sailors send their resolution to the Soviet government. And what do you think the response of the Bolshevik government might be? Should we have an open dialogue with these sailors? Should we treat these heroes of the revolution with the respect they deserve? No. When the Bolshevik government, the Council of People's Commissars, learns of the rebellion brewing at Kronstadt, the government immediately denounces the sailors' revolutionary committee as, quote, a counter-revolutionary provocation. And they call upon the sailors to surrender immediately, branding them as rebels, not as fellow comrades in arms, not as heroes of the revolution, not as the avant-garde, the vanguard of the revolution, no, but as rebels. Now, this is a very tense situation. You have about 3,500 sailors based at Kronstadt, and there's a lot of guns and a lot of ammunition. The sailors are well trained, they're battle hardened, and they're ready for a fight. They've brought down one regime before, the provisional government, and the Bolsheviks are naturally quite concerned that they might be able to bring down a second, their own. So the Bolshevik response, the government response, is to tell the soldiers to stand down. Tell the sailors, excuse me, to stand down. The sailors refuse. Trotsky, as Commissar of Military Affairs, Commissar of War, issues an ultimatum. Sailors who do not heed the call of the Bolshevik government, those who do not surrender, will be shot like sitting ducks, he says. There's a standoff. And finally, Trotsky orders action. On March 7th, 1921, elite units from the Red Army, as many as 50,000 strong, attack the rebel sailors at Kronstadt. It's March on the Baltic. There's a blizzard going on. This arm of the Baltic Sea is frozen over. The soldiers, the Red Army soldiers, march across toward the base at Kronstadt to reach the fortress. It's a hard-fought battle that rages for more than 10 days, but by March 18th, the Red Army has taken the sailors' citadel. They've seized Kronstadt. And here you see a photograph of the Red Army soldiers sort of in the aftermath of the fall of Kronstadt. The ringleaders of the sailor rebellion are rounded up, interrogated by the Cheka, forced to name names. They're shot. The rest of the participants are sent off to prison camps in Siberia. And so the rebellion at Kronstadt is crushed by Soviet power, by the application of violent, coercive techniques. Some other scenes from the fighting. You see the Red Army has positioned machine guns, riflemen at the ready for their final assault on the citadel. Bolshevik propaganda presents the storming of Kronstadt as a great victory, a victory of the true revolution against the forces of counter-revolution. And this is a bit of propaganda poster that says the Kronstadt card is trumped. And you see that the sailor, who purports to be a son of the revolution, is truly, when flipped, just a representative of the old order, a czarist gendarme, a czarist policeman with the whip, the knout, over his shoulder. So the Kronstadt card has been trumped. The sailors, who we thought were true sons of the revolution, have been revealed to be the counter-revolutionary provocateurs and rebels that they've been all along. So thankfully, Bolshevik power, Soviet power, has saved the people from this enemy in our midst. This is the public face that the regime puts forward to explain and justify the assault on Kronstadt. But in reality, for the Bolshevik leadership, the Kronstadt uprising was a big wake-up call, because these counter-revolutionaries were not former people, bывшие люди, right? They weren't white generals. They weren't members of the bourgeoisie. They weren't priests and capitalists and kulaks. They were the sailors who had made the October Revolution not 4 years before. And now they have grown so disillusioned with the regime that they put into power that they were willing to fight and die to overturn it and to implement their principles of justice and equity. And if the sailors, the heart and soul of the revolution, if the sailors are this angry, Lenin and the Bolsheviks reason, we need to take steps to rectify this situation. We need to bring the destructive, misguided policies of war communism to an end. So by 1921, the Bolshevik leadership, Lenin himself, realizes that the party has overreached its grasp with the policies of war communism. And Lenin, especially, I think, realizes that this leap forward, this grand, glorious transition from the rubble of capitalism to the future socialist order, cannot take place overnight. It cannot take place in one great leap forward. The task before us, the task of socialist construction, has to be faced in a more realistic manner. And we have to stretch it out, if necessary, over several years. And we have to accomplish it perhaps by different, softer means and methods. And this is the rationale behind the new course that the party adopts at the 10th Party Congress in March of 1921. A party Congress was an institution going back to the very founding days of the Russian Marxist movement at the turn of the 20th century. You'll recall that it was at the Second Party Congress in 1903, with the debates over Lenin's pamphlet, What is to be Done, that the Russian Marxist movement had split into its Bolshevik and Menshevik wings. The Bolsheviks continued to hold party congresses. And a party congress was a big affair. You had delegates sent from party organizations all across the country, county level, provincial level. The cities would send delegates, factories would send delegates, representatives of national minorities would send delegates, military units would send delegates as well. And they would meet usually in Moscow, sometimes in Petrograd or Petersburg, but usually in Moscow. The 10th Party Congress, held in the spring of 1921, had about 700 members. And the Party Congress basically was convened to approve and vote in favor of resolutions and decisions that had already been made behind closed doors by the party elite. This was a forum for the party to gain a kind of stamp of approval from the rank and file of the party for decisions that had already been made by party elites. So this was not necessarily a forum for a vigorous exchange of ideas, although in the early days, in the 20s, there were some. very heated party congresses, as we'll see in weeks to come. By the time you get to Stalin, the party congress is really just a rubber stamp vehicle for whatever Stalin wants. And it remains more or less that way throughout the history of the Soviet Union. But in the 20s, there's some real excitement. And here you see just a few of the 700 delegates on picture day. There's Lenin, there's Trotsky. And also the party congress was an opportunity for the party elite to build small d democratic bridges with the rank and file members of the party, and to give some public evidence and credence for the fact that the party was truly a kind of democratically functioning organization that listened to the voices and concerns of the people, the working people. So at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin unveils a new economic policy. Lenin gives a powerful speech in which he speaks very openly about the gravity of the present situation. He says, in this backwards country, the workers who have made unprecedented sacrifices and the mass of peasants are in a state of utter exhaustion after 7 years of uninterrupted war. And this condition borders on a complete loss of productive capacity, the problem we talked about last time, right? There's just no breath left in the industrial machinery of the Soviet economy. We cannot produce. If we cannot produce, we will be destroyed by our capitalist imperialist enemies. Lenin at the 10th Party Congress admits that the danger we face now from peasant revolt is greater than any danger we faced at the hands of the white generals whom we've beaten back. And at this very time, March 1921, while the 10th Party Congress is in session, the standoff with the Kronstadt sailors is heating up. And so Lenin can say, look, just 60 miles or so from Petrograd, the sailors themselves are agitated. So the panic we're facing, the threat we're facing is general, is wide-reaching. So what we need right now, at this moment, Lenin tells the Congress, is, quote, an economic breathing space. And Lenin urges a radical departure from the policies of war communism, from the tempo and techniques of war communism. He says we need a new economic policy. First and foremost, we have to placate the peasants. We have to appease the peasants, not the kulaks, but the middle and poor peasants who are our base of support in the countryside. We have to do away with the grain requisitionings, right? This idea that we can make the peasants surrender grain at gunpoint. Let's replace that, Lenin says, with a tax in kind, a tax that the peasants can pay to agents of Soviet power in the form of produce, in grain or other means of agricultural delivery, but the tax would be set at a progressive rate so that poor peasants would pay a very small tax in kind, middle peasants would pay a bit more, and the kulaks would pay a huge tax because screw the kulaks, right? Lenin and the party has not backed down on that element of class war. That tax in kind was later replaced by a tax that was payable in cash as the 1920s went on. But the point to bear in mind here is that this tax that Lenin is talking about would be about half of the bill that peasants had been asked to shoulder during war communism. So this is an enormous relief. Along with the tax replacing requisitioning, Lenin suggests that whatever the peasants are able to produce, whatever a peasant household is able to grow and produce over and above the tax burden, over and above what they need to feed their families and set aside a bit of seed grain for next year's sowing season, anything that the peasant produces as surplus can be sold at market for profit. This seems to violate the very principles of Marxist economics. It seems to violate the very principles that the government had been pursuing during the past 4 years of war communism. And this sent some shocks through the hallway of the 10th Party Congress, as you might imagine. What Lenin is calling for is a kind of reconfiguration of the Soviet economy. He insists that the state continue to hold on to what he calls the commanding heights of the economy. He's using this military language of tactics, right? You hold the high ground, you hold the commanding heights. The state, through its planning agency, VSNK, will continue to retain control over large industry, railroads, banking, foreign trade, etc. But we will legalize private trading. We will legalize small businesses. We will legalize independent, small-scale operations. We'll legalize private trade. So what Lenin is unveiling here at the 10th Party Congress in the form of this new economic policy is a kind of mixed economy that will combine elements of a private economy, a capitalist economy, with a public or socialist economy. The state will hold on to the big stuff, the commanding heights of heavy industry, infrastructure, transportation, foreign trade. Agriculture and private enterprise will be allowed to flourish in private hands. So the party approves this, and Lenin was the only guy in the party who probably could have pushed this through. I mean, this is a testament to Lenin's charisma and the authority he wielded in party circles. The party Congress, the 10th Party Congress, votes to accept the resolution. The 10th Party Congress approves the new economic policy. So war communism is dead. Long live the NEP, or NEP, the new economic policy. Within a year, economic life in Russia was rejuvenated. It was unrecognizable. 1922 was a very different year from 1921. The harvests have recovered from the droughts. The confiscatory requisitioning policies have come to an end. The food armies have been demobilized, and you have this rapid revival of trade. In towns and cities, thousands of bazaars and marketplaces like this spring up. Food is coming back into the urban centers. Food is coming back into the cities. Peasant traders are taking their surplus grain, their surplus meat, their surplus dairy, and taking it to the cities, and the urban populations are being fed. And the workers and urban residents are selling goods as well. You see, there's all sorts of objects for sale here at this peasant, sort of peasant-run bazaar on the outskirts of Moscow. So the peasants now have an economic incentive to produce. Right? Their food is not going to be taken away from them at gunpoint. And with that economic incentive, agricultural production rises dramatically. And it soon comes back to pre-World War I levels. The recovery of agriculture allows also for the recovery of industrial production. By 1925, Soviet industrial production is still below 1913 levels, but it has increased 500% from where it was in 1920 at the height of war communism. So much food is now coming into the cities that rationing is abolished soon after the introduction of NEP in 1921. So there's all sorts of interconnected and correlative aftershocks, after effects, positive ones, that come about as a result of NEP. The recovery of industry, slow but recovering. The end of rationing. The recovery of the agricultural sector. The whole aim of NEP is to put out the fires inadvertently created by war communism and build bridges once more between the city and the countryside. And the word smychka, I want to go back to the terms and show you this word. The Russian word smychka begins to appear with regularity in Bolshevik speeches and articles during the years of NEP. The word smychka means a union or a linkage or a partnership. And during NEP, the word smychka was used to refer to the cooperation and alliance between the industrial proletariat, the factory workers in the cities, and the rural peasantry. And the party stresses throughout the years of NEP that this alliance between the peasant and the worker is absolutely crucial if the socialist experiment is to proceed and succeed. The failure of grain requisitioning during war communism had shown the party leadership just how much depended on maintaining a happy harmony between the urban centers of the country and the rural population of the country, between worker and peasant. Because again, what happens if you don't have a content peasantry? No food is coming to the cities. If no food, then no factories. No factories means no production, no guns, and the forces of world counter-revolution will crush us in our sleep. So here you see a classic representation from the NEP period of this idea of smychka. And you see the peasant in peasant dress with his sickle on the ground, and the factory worker with his hammer and anvil, and they're clutching each other's hands in a warm embrace, and they're each pointing to what their sector of the economy is delivering to the other. So the peasant is showing how all this grain is being piled onto trains headed for the cities, and the worker is showing how all of these factory workers in his town are loading the trains up with new agricultural technology, combines, and new farming implements that are heading out to make the life of the peasant easier. And the caption reads, "Only a close, unbreakable union of workers and peasants will save Russia from razrucha and starvation." If we're going to escape the danger of economic devastation and the toll of famine and hunger, we need a close, unbreakable union of workers and peasants. And this idea of smychka is central to that. The symbol of smychka, and the tools here in the foreground give you some hint of that. The symbol of smychka is the hammer and sickle, which becomes the official Soviet insignia in the 1920s. The symbol had already appeared during the revolution. During the revolutionary year of 1917, of course, it appears later on the Soviet flag. This is a medal from the Stalinist 1930s awarded to prize-winning factory workers who overfulfilled their quotas, who defeated their fellow workers in these socialist competitions of labor. But if you think about it, what does the symbol of the hammer and sickle represent? It represents the idea of smychka. It represents the union of the industrial worker who wields the hammer and the peasant laborer who wields the sickle. The benefits of NEP affected not only the peasants, but also the urban centers as well. Once the village got back to a market economy, the urban economy was affected as well. If the peasants are now allowed to sell their surplus produce in the cities for cash, well, to get them to do that, they have to have something to spend their cash on. And so under NEP, the Bolshevik regime allows licenses for private enterprises and small businesses to be set up. So you have small service shops, restaurants, cafes, consumer industries. By 1923, 2 years after the introduction of NEP, 83% of retail trade, buying and selling, small business, 83% is in private hands. That's a complete reversal from the statistics we saw last time uh, with regard to war communism. So far from having died an ignominious death, the money economy had returned, the cash economy had returned to Russia. These changes were so fast and so overwhelming for many that people felt their heads spin. Um, the great novelist of the 1920s, Andrei Platonov, uh, in one of his works, describes a character who has come home to his town after serving in the Red Army, and he sees the marketplaces flourishing. He sees the bazaars and shops open once more. He sees people with food to eat, and it blows his mind. Platonov writes of his character. At first, he thought the whites must be in town. At the station, there was a cafe where they were selling white bread rolls without ration cards. There were no lines. In the shops, he saw all of the equipments of trade once seen in his long-forgotten youth. Counters under glass, shelves stocked along the walls, proper scales on the shelves, courteous assistants instead of government bureaucrats, a lively crowd of purchasers, and shelves of food which breathed an air of well-being. And the character, practically speechless, asks the shopkeeper, "What is going on here?" And the shopkeeper smiles and says, "Lenin had taketh away, and now Lenin giveth back." Uh, so he sort of understands it as kind of like a biblical process of uh, a sort of cycle, if you will. And scenes like this, here you see a peasant woman kind of stuffing her face as she's preparing to set up her vending tables. The 20s were a rollicking time, particularly in the cities. One of the unintended consequences of NEP was the reintroduction of a wealthy, privileged class. If you think back to last week's short story, The Cave by Yevgeny Zamyatin, where the city of Petrograd appeared like something out of a frozen ice age, that seemed like a distant memory by the mid-1920s. In 1920s Petrograd, soon to be Leningrad, in Moscow, in Kiev, casinos are open, cabarets and nightclubs. You see luxury cars on the street, furs, jewelry. Uh, the businessmen who made small fortunes in the 1920s, the new economic elite that came to power, economic power, as a result of NEP, were known as NEP men. And over the course of the 1920s, NEP men comes to be a kind of term of derision, term of scorn. But the point here is that social stratification is coming back to the cities. Social stratification is coming back to the countryside as well. The kulaks, the rich peasants, account for about 5% of the rural population. But that 5% is producing 25% of the grain that goes to market. The kulaks own their own farm equipment. They own their own livestock. They can hire the labor of poor peasants. And the poor peasants, who have practically no land because they've sold it off, they have practically no livestock because they've sold it off. The poor peasants account for 35% of the Russian peasantry, but only a very small portion of what they're producing is going to market. So stop and think about what this means. What this means is that a very small stratum, the kulaks again, are benefiting economically from NEP. They're getting rich. They're getting fat. The poor peasants have been relieved enormously with the end of war communism, but they're not prospering under NEP. So there's a growing disparity. There's a growing inequality that is produced by NEP. And all policies, economic or otherwise, have unintended consequences. And social stratification, social division the creation of a new propertied class, a new wealthy class in the cities, the boosting of kulak fortunes in the countryside. This is an unintended consequence of NEP. Lenin and the Bolsheviks did not intend this to happen. And it brings with it nagging questions. Many in the party elites, rank and file party members, begin to ask, what did we have a revolution for if it was simply to bring back the bourgeoisie and make the kulaks richer? Is that what we had a revolution for? Is that what we just fought 4 years of civil war for? To fatten the bellies of the kulaks? Fill the pockets of the bourgeoisie? This cartoon from the 1920s suggests that something's wrong here. This is a cartoon from an official Soviet magazine, casting a kind of ominous look at what NEP hath wrought, what the unexpected consequences of NEP might be. Here you see a worker, gaunt, emaciated, standing in the rain, in the dark, peering into a window, while well-fed, well-dressed NEP men are drinking and toasting and hoisting their glasses. Who has the revolution benefited? Some are beginning to ask. So NEP was absolutely necessary. The new economic policy, unveiled in March of 1921, restores certain elements of the market economy back to Russia. And if we think about early Bolshevik policy, as I've suggested, as a kind of balancing act between ideological conviction and necessary concessions to reality, NEP is definitely a concession to reality. It's a pragmatic move. We have to do this or we're dead, Lenin says, right? It's also a recognition that the jump into socialism is going to take more time than we'd thought. By 1921, even the most hardcore, die-hard Bolshevik realizes that global revolution, the global revolution we've been waiting for the past 4 years, is not about to break out anytime soon. Or at least it's not about to break out as quickly as everyone had hitherto thought. Which means that Soviet Russia will have to go it alone for the time being until the inevitable, eventual workers' revolution does happen. But because we might have to wait longer than expected, Soviet Russia cannot afford to perish by means of a reckless, headlong leap forward into communism. We will still build the socialist society, we will still achieve the socialist project, but it must be done more carefully, more deliberately, with more caution than we've hitherto attempted. So the phrase that Lenin uses to describe NEP is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're still progressing towards our goal, we're still advancing, but we have to make unavoidable concessions to reality. We're taking a slightly different, more circuitous, more gradual route to get to our goal. In 1922, in a speech, Lenin describes NEP as a mountain climber on a long, winding path to the summit. He has to get to the top. He can't climb straight up the mountain. He has to work his way up. That's how we, the party, and the workers and peasants, will get to the top of the mountain. That's how we will get to socialism, not by running straight up, but by taking a gradual, careful, and planned out path. So NEP is not a retreat, as critics may claim. NEP is a more cautious move forward. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Western historians writing about the Soviet 1920s often romanticize NEP as a kind of lost golden age, a lost opportunity. NEP, had it lasted, and NEP, I should say, lasts from 1921 to 1928 or so. Had NEP lasted, what would the Soviet Union have looked like? The Soviet Union would have developed in very different ways. Um, we wouldn't have had Stalinism. The Soviet Union could have developed into a more open kind of society. Um, that's an argument made by the American historian and political scientist Stephen Cohen in his book Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, which is a political biography of Nikolai Bukharin, whom we've encountered as uh, the co-author of the ABC of Communism. Bukharin was also a great champion of NEP and an eventual victim of Stalinism. Um, so Cohen and other revisionist historians working in the West in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s uh, saw NEP as this kind of golden age, a kind of what if NEP had not been brought to an abrupt and inglorious end by the reintroduction by Stalin of coercive economic policies, what could have happened? Could the Soviet Union have developed in a different way? Maybe there wouldn't have been a Cold War. Maybe there wouldn't have been a decades-long confrontation with Western powers. Maybe we wouldn't be stuck in this arms race. So who knows what could have happened? There wouldn't have been a great terror. There wouldn't have been the Siberian gulags. Everything would have been different. Arts and culture might have flourished as it did in the 1920s. It could have continued to do so. The world as we know it will be a different place. It's all great to think that way. And Cohen's book on Bukharin is an absolutely brilliant book, even if it's, I think, basically wrong in its argumentation. Because what Cohen and other scholars in his camp tend to gloss over is that NEP was always seen at the time by party leaders as a temporary transitional phase. It was but a way station on the winding road forward to socialism. Zinoviev, the party boss of Petrograd, one of Lenin's closest comrades, writes in 1922, NEP is only a temporary deviation, a tactical retreat, a clearing of the land for a new, decisive offensive of labor against the organized front of international capitalism. In other words, NEP is not surrender. NEP is not a new stasis, a new form of reality. We have not turned our back on the principles of October. We are moving forward just more slowly. And lest we romanticize NEP too much or view it with rosy glasses, which is easy to do considering how bad the 30s are. The 20s look pretty damn good by comparison. But it's worth remembering that NEP is an economic concession only, not a political concession. What do I mean? NEP brings about a loosening, a relaxation in the economic sphere, right, with the reintroduction of private trade. There is no accompanying loosening in the political sphere. The 10th Party Congress, the same party Congress that introduces NEP, passes also, at Lenin's behest, the resolution on party discipline, calling for tighter discipline within the party, rejecting the calls of Mensheviks and SRs to relax censorship and introduce freedom of the press, and condemning the Kronstadt sailors, the heroes of October, as traitors, butchers, and counter-revolutionaries. So let's not overly glorify NEP. Now, if you ask me or anyone else, would you rather live in 1926 Moscow or 1936 Moscow? Always say 1926 Moscow. It's a much safer and much more delightful place to be, I assure you. But the 20s look good compared to the 30s because the 30s were so bad. And we'll talk a lot more about the 30s, the Stalin 30s to come. But I wanted to just draw your attention to this point that I made sort of in the bullet points, that this economic relaxation, economic reform brings about no political liberalization, no political democratization. In fact, factions within the party are officially banned. The idea is that when the party has decided on a particular question, it is the party member's right, it is the duty, the obligation of every party member to put aside his personal convictions and support the will of the party. If there's 100 of us and the vote is 90-10, those 10 who were against it had now better be for whatever the issue on the table may be. Those 10 do not have the right to form a bloc or faction within the party. And this anti-faction resolution passed by the party Congress, the 10th Party Congress in 1921, will become the club, the cudgel that Stalin will use to go after his political enemies in the 1930s. And he can do so by claiming he's acting in accordance with Lenin's wishes. So he's always able to cloak his moves against rivals by claiming that he is acting in a manner fitting with the will of Lenin. Very clever. I want to end on this poster here. This is a later poster from the 1960s, but it's sort of celebrating the vision of Comrade Lenin. It's a quotation from Lenin. It says, "From NEP Russia, there will be socialist Russia," right? Socialist Russia will come out of NEP Russia. And we see Lenin, as always, kind of pointing the way forward toward the kingdom of socialism. One of the points we'll see in the weeks to come is that there's going to be heated debate within the party after Lenin's death in 1924 as to how long NEP should last. How long should we allow this temporary interlude to go on for? And when do we get back to the fast track of building socialism? And there will be intense, heated debates within the party, debates that will culminate in the 30s with rather murderous outcomes, debates that will see Stalin and his supporters emerge victorious in the so-called faction struggles for power that take place after Lenin's death in 24. So I'm going to stop there and close up this lecture. How do I do this again? Sorry. Stop the share. Okay. So that's what I want to say about NEP. I want you to think about this transition from war communism to NEP. What does it mean? What are the implications of it? How does the party rationalize this? I want you to think about NEP again as an example of the party making a pragmatic concession to reality, one that doesn't necessarily jive with ideological convictions, but one that is mandated by need, by necessity, and will connect the relative freedom of the NEP years with the policies of culture building that we're going to turn to next week in week 6. Okay? So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to seeing you on Friday for our discussion. Come with questions, email me with questions, and we'll resume then. Okay? Thanks a lot.